So the way we make a Manhattan, we can either use American whiskey, either a bourbon whiskey or a rye. Originally, Manhattan was made with rye whiskey because it originated on the East Coast, and the East Coast was where rye came from, and it was in the Midwest where bourbon came from. And so any drink that was invented on the East Coast with a whiskey in it would have used a rye whiskey. So I'm going to use rye whiskey for this, but a good bourbon works as well too. I like using a 3-to-1 ratio of bourbon or whiskey and sweet vermouth. So that's 3 parts of whiskey and 1 part of sweet vermouth. Whatever the measures you might want to have works fine on it. In this particular drink, since I have a slightly larger cocktail glass here, and I'm assuming I'm going to be having maybe just 1 cocktail tonight, I'm going to take and use 2 ounces of rye whiskey. And then I'm going to use about 3/4 of an ounce of sweet vermouth. One thing interesting on something like a Manhattan and combining the sweet vermouth and the whiskey, what your ratios are might actually change just slightly when you really become an expert at it, depending upon what sweet vermouth you're using and what whiskey you're using. Because different whiskeys have a different character to them. And since this drink is all about balance, the idea is to take and make sure the ingredients are properly balancing one against another. You don't want the whiskey to taste too much over the top. And again, you don't want the sweet vermouth to taste too forward either. Just a couple dashes of Angostura Bitters. And then we'll add the ice. Now the origin of the Manhattan is questionable. A lot of people are saying that Winston Churchill's mother or aunt or something like that invented it in New York. I heard some report once was saying that couldn't have happened because the only time she could have done that in New York, from time standpoint, she actually wasn't in New York, she was in England, and so that's not where it came from. What actually probably happened is this drink recipe became popular as a way of making cocktails in the New York area, and it was actually made at different clubs in New York. You had the Turf Club making the Turf Club cocktail. You had the Manhattan Club making the Manhattan Club cocktail. And basically they were the exact same cocktail. It's just the Manhattan Club, I guess, was more popular, and so their cocktail, the Manhattan cocktail, became more popular, and that's why we have the Manhattan today. Now you notice I'm stirring this cocktail with ice rather than shaking it, and there's a very good reason for that. If I were to shake it, the drink would end up having a crusty foam on the top of it, and as well as being rather cloudy. That comes from the sweet vermouth that's being added that is actually holding the air bubbles and foaming up slightly on top. And so you always want to take and stir a cocktail that has all clear ingredients in it so you don't get either the foamy top or the cloudiness in the drink. Stirring takes a little bit longer than shaking does, but the ice melts a little bit slower and it gets just as cold. And so stirring and shaking are basically the exact same. Now another thing comes up with the Manhattan cocktail is what to garnish it with. The garnish that's been used forever is the cherry, the maraschino cherry, or how it's more properly pronounced, the maraschino cherry. You're probably familiar with seeing those little jars of maraschino cherries or maraschino cherries in the jars at your supermarket, bright red. The way these are made are basically to take a regular cherry, a nice red cherry, and they soak it in chemicals to extract all the flavor and all of the color out of it. So you end up with just this pale cherry that's left, but the fruit remains very firm and actually firms up a little bit extra on top of it, so it ends up making a very solid fruit to use in it. They then take and soak it in artificially colored, artificially flavored syrup to put back into it some flavor and color. Now, the original maraschino cherries, which came from Marasca, were actually Marasca cherries, which were soaked in maraschino liqueur. Those came in prior to Prohibition, and during the pre-Prohibition days, at the very tail end, right before Prohibition came in place, the temperance union was pretty big, and they were telling people they shouldn't be having alcohol and stuff like that. And so people were kind of looking for non-alcoholic alternatives, and that's where our modern maraschino cherry came from. In fact, the Food and Drug Act of 1906, I believe, even said that these cherries had to be called imitation maraschino cherries because they weren't true Marasca cherries soaked in brandy. To be called a maraschino cherry, you had to actually be a Marasca cherry soaked in either brandy or maraschino liqueur. Now you can find some nice cherries that aren't quite as pale as those. These are some maraschino liqueurs that I found in a gourmet market. You'll notice the color is not quite as brilliant red, not quite as artificial looking. They're actually using natural flavors and natural colors in here. The process is fairly similar though, in that they first want to take and soak the cherries to kind of get them prepared for taking on the extra flavors and colors being added to it. So it still has that issue. What I like doing is actually making my own. And so what I've done is I've got some dried Bing cherries here that I then soaked in brandy in order to reconstitute them slightly. I could also soak them either vodka or I could soak them in maraschino liqueur as well to add that. By using brandy, I think it works better in a Manhattan because it's not going to take and add that sweetness and that maraschino cherry or maraschino liqueur flavor to it. Since these are stemmed, I've got to use a pick. So we're going to take and put a pick here and just get one of these cherries in there. Add that to my Manhattan. And there we have a Manhattan cocktail.